Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Zoom discussion on democracy and the role of wiretapping in modern Europe. My name's Mark Pennington, and I'm the director of the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society here at King's College London, hosting the event today. So the motivation for this event really is a series of quite prominent wiretapping scandals that have taken place in Greece, but also in other parts of Europe, that raise serious questions about really the nature of modern democratic systems and the kind of political freedoms that people are exercising within them. And I don't think it's just the case of these particular wiretapping scandals that we may be concerned with here. I think there are broader issues raised about the nature of what some people would argue is a kind of modern surveillance state that is developing, and the implications that that may have for questions of democracy. So I'm very pleased to say that to engage these questions, we have with us today 4 guests. We're very fortunate to have 2 members of the European Parliament. I know how busy they are, so we're very grateful that you've been able to take the time out to join us in this discussion. So we have Sophie, who is a Dutch politician with Renew Europe, and we also have Petros Kokkalis, who is a member of the European Parliament from Greece. We also have 2 academic members of the panel. Dr. Nikos Erinakis is Assistant Professor of Social and Political Philosophy and Philosophy of Culture at the University of Crete, and Dr. Georgios Samaras is Assistant Professor in the School of Government and the Policy Institute here at King's College London. So the format for the event today is going to be each of our 4 guests is going to make some introductory remarks, really just setting out briefly their thoughts about this question of wiretapping and the surveillance state more broadly. We'll then move into a more open-ended discussion between the participants, and throughout, those of you who are attending on Zoom, you're welcome to put your questions in the chat box, and we can get to some of those maybe during the free-flowing discussion, but also perhaps towards the end of the event. And we're looking to run for around about an hour. So I'd like to start off, if I may, by asking Sophie to comment first of all on your thoughts about the events that have been taking place with this wiretapping, and perhaps more broadly about these questions of surveillance and democracy.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I apologize for being a little bit late, and I also apologize for having to leave at 7:30 sharp. No, I'll try and be brief, and I'll also try and not to depress you altogether. But I have to say I have a fairly gloomy outlook on the whole topic at the moment. I mean, it's fairly simple. If you consider that democracy is not just about elections, because, well, just look at Russia, their elections, it's not a democracy. Democracy is about checks and balances, about powers and countervailing powers, about scrutiny, about accountability, about democratic oversight, and all those things. So that implies that those forces who are holding power to account, who are scrutinizing power, that they should be independent, free, safe, etc. But if power, governments, whatever, if they have the means to control the ones whom they're scrutinized by, then basically democracy is dead. It's that simple. If spyware is being used, and it is being used, and I'm not afraid to say, I think in the vast majority of cases, it's being used for political purposes, including in the European Union. Because, make no mistake, it's not as if we say we make a distinction between democratic governments which are abusing spyware and undemocratic governments. The mere fact of abusing spyware makes you undemocratic, and what we witness is that if you leave aside all the very unsavory regimes elsewhere in the world, let's look at the United States and Europe. In the US, at least they're taking some action, although there is a degree of hypocrisy there, because They're going after commercial spyware manufacturers, and they don't want commercial spyware, but of course they are using spyware themselves, just homemade, because they have the capacity. In Europe, it's a bit different. We rely more on commercial spyware than they do, but at least there is some legislative action. Spyware vendors have been blacklisted. Sanctions have been imposed on Intellexa. In Europe, nothing has happened. Like literally nothing. It's like, running into a brick wall time and time again. I'm just coming out of a meeting where we discussed the fact that over time, members of the European Parliament have been targeted. Now, we knew one case, the friend of Petros, Mr. Androulakis, who had been targeted most probably from people within government circles, let me put it that way, or at least within circles of Nea Demokratia. But there are other cases. Apparently, the phone of the president of the European Parliament, as well as the chair of the Fisheries Committee, had been targeted unsuccessfully with Pegasus by the Vietnamese authorities, something to do with the fisheries agreement. Now we know that the chair of the Defense Committee and another member of the Defense Committee, staff of the Defense Committee, have been targeted with Pegasus, probably successfully. But the point is, all of this is then swept under the carpet. Nobody has made any attempt to find out who is behind this. Now, I find the difference in reaction to, for example, Qatargate, where Qatari officials were trying to bribe members of the European Parliament, getting undue influence, if you want. Well, I don't see how this is different. People from the outside, and it may be that they're non-EU actors, probably state actors, but it may also be that they are EU governments behind this. And in the case of Pegasus, it's very easy. You pick up the phone, you call NSO and the Israeli authorities, and you say, we want to know who's behind this, because they have all the information. And the fact that in particular at this moment in time, where everybody says, we're allies with the Israeli authorities, etc., you might expect, if we have friendly relations with the government, that they would also help us if members of parliament in the European Union are being targeted or potentially being targeted, because we never know. We may be targeted, or this is this permanent cloud hanging over your head. And that means that basically in Europe, there is complete and utter impunity for the abuse of spyware and the illicit trade of spyware. There is what I call omerta, which is like a mafia pact silence. I'm not afraid to use that term, between the national governments, not just the ones who are abusing it or who are, let's say, involved in the illicit trade, but also the others, because they all ultimately want to keep access to this toy, lest they would want to use it at some point in time. And what I find is I'll come to my conclusion. There was an initiative by the US last year, a year and a half ago, having some sort of an alliance against spyware or something like this. And all of a sudden you see EU governments willing to sign up to that. And I think, why? Why, when you flatly refuse to use a transparent democratic process to legislate, to follow up on the recommendations of the European Parliament, which has been elected by over 200 million voters. If you refuse to do that, like literally, not a comma, they're not transposing anything of what we said. And then they're going like, oh, but we want to be part of this alliance. It's totally hypocritical. So we have to conclude that the governments of the 27 member states of the European Union, plus the European Commission, are deliberately using spyware, or at least reserving the right to use spyware against citizens for political purposes. This is the conclusion. And I do not see, if national governments are not tackling this, if the European Parliament is being flatly stonewalled by the Commission and the member states, then, unless people take to the streets, it's going to be very difficult to do something about it. But most people are not aware of this issue. They feel they're not concerned. It's invisible. So yes, I think this is a massive, massive, massive threat to democracy, much more than, all the talk about, I don't know, fake news. And I mean, that's also all very dangerous and everything. But this is just as big. Let me put it like that then, be a bit more cautious. Okay. I hope you're not entirely depressed now.
Thank you very much, Sophie. So Petros, can I come to you next?
Yes, hello, and thank you for inviting me. And first of all, I'd like to thank Sophie for all the work she has done and carried out through the PEGA inquiry, which apparently results at nothing happening. And I would like just to drop a few facts of what was going on in Greece so you can judge for yourselves whether this erodes the quality of democracy or not. Now, we have a government which moved to take the National Security Agency directly to the Prime Minister's office, and the Prime Minister's office person responsible for that was his nephew. Once it was found out that the head of the Socialist Party, Mr. Erinakis, was targeted by the Pegasus spyware, and it was then consequently revealed that he was also at the same time targeted by the national, let's say in a legal way, by the National Security Agency. This person, Mr. Dimitriadis, was asked to step down. That happened about 2 years ago, and he has not been asked by the Greek judicial to bring forward a statement. At the same time, there has been a series of weakening of democratic institutions in the sense that there has been changes in the composition of the relevant independent authority, which is supposed to look after these things. The majority was changed with a fantastic mathematical change of what constitutes 3/5, and that was changed. At the same time, the highest or judicial authority pressed charges not against the people who might have or have actually violated fundamental human rights, but against the independent authority that was looking into it. We had a parliamentary inquiry committee which was stonewalled, and there was a very big issue on having people testifying in front of the parliament and invoking the national security clause, so they didn't actually testify. So you have like an avalanche of interventions to the judicial authorities, to the independent authorities, to the parliamentary inquiry authorities, all aimed at stonewalling the investigation. We also now have a very new development where we have lost track of the process of identifying and connecting the dots between people who were being wiretapped, and not exactly wiretapped, were being followed by both the Predator and the National Security Agency, which gives you a clear indication that there was a common group that was operating with the security services and with a commercial system. The Predator, mind you, is a system that does not only wiretap your conversation, but acts as, let's say, a fly on the wall that can keep track of all the actions that we all do in our phones. And this was, apparently turns out that this software was used intermittently with the official systems. And it was not only used for people that were involved in politics, it was also used for commercial meaning business people, for friends and maybe romantic friends, and wherever they could use it, they did. Now, there is obviously a great cache of material that has been illegally obtained, and it is in the it is now in the hands of somebody we don't know, and that is a time bomb in the political system. And now we are looking at a company which was sanctioned by the United States but it's still operating in Greece. So not only the practice of surveillance, but also the practice of covering up the surveillance has been in the past 2 years poisoning the quality of the state, of the rule of law and the democracy in Greece. And all these subsequent actions to cover up have really undermined the trust of the Greek public to everything, really, to the police, to the national security, to the prime minister, to the judicial authorities, to the mass media, and to everything. And this, I will agree with Sophie, cannot be good for democracy.
Okay, thank you very much, Nikos. So, sorry, Petros, I'd like to go to Nikos next. Nikos Erinakis, your thoughts?
Yeah, first things first, thank you very much for the invitation and being with you today. I thought that I should actually make a step backwards and give a more philosophical, democratic view on what is the situation now, the paradoxes that we are faced with, and perhaps a step towards solution in terms of ideas and values, and then in order to enrich the discussion that Sophie and Petros have begun. So, to begin with, the first thing that we are faced with, I guess, is that we are currently faced with a very strange paradox. On the one hand, we tend to believe, I underline the tend to believe, but still I am confident about it, that Europe, the European Union, remains, if not the most, at least one of the most democratic and progressive political entities, unities in the world. Still, on the other hand, we are faced with very, very strong and very serious democratic deficits. Some of them were already mentioned in detail and depth, that need to be addressed and need to be addressed very fast, very quick, before things get more serious. And I believe that already we are very late in terms of the European Union elections that we are going to face. Some, let's say, not only strange, but very sad surprises. And we can discuss about them later on. So these deficits, the democratic deficits, actually reflect the complexities and challenges that societies, European societies, especially also in Greece, and the region, the general region, are facing. Let me just mention very briefly that we are experiencing an unprecedented multiplicity of the consecutive crises that especially persist in duration. So we have the socio-economical, we have the cultural crisis, we have the environmental crisis, of course, the refugee immigrant crisis, the pandemic crisis, the energy, the war in Ukraine and Gaza, and now we are experiencing certain crises in institutions. So let's say an institutional crisis, part of which is all the examples that were mentioned before in the panel, and all this while we are in the midst of the fourth industrial revolutions, let's say the digital revolution, so what we may call artificial intelligence, general intelligence, artificial creativity, etc. And how, in this sense, are we to deal with this kind of crisis, and how we are to deal more specifically with the institutional crisis or the institutional problems that are creating this, let's say, strong, serious democratic deficits. I believe that in a certain sense, the problem is also a cultural one. In which sense I'm mentioning that? If you notice the polls in Greece, let's speak about Greece, but I believe this is actually true for the European Union in general, you may notice that aspects, topics like the one that we're discussing today is very, very low in popularity. This may be a different discussion, but the vast majority of, let's say, the Greek people or other people around Europe do not give, let's say, the necessary attention to this kind of problems, the democratic deficits that we have. And why is that? They're not stupid. Perhaps they believe that, okay, the elite just has a surveillance system towards the elite. Either this is the political or the economical, etc. Perhaps they are more interested in terms of economical aspects of the salaries. But if we are to understand the big notions that we have to deal with and problems in the next decade, and this is the environmental one, Petros has many things to say about that, I'm sure, and also Sophie, of course, and the digital one, the digital revolutions that we are in, and the whole, let's say, transformation in terms of labor, in terms of our everyday lives, we see that we need to concentrate again in values and political and ethical moral values in order to be sure that not only the elites top down, but also bottom up, all these transformations will be embodied with the right value system in order to remain democratic and in order to be, as a society, alert in any democratic threat that we may have, and we are having many. So I don't want to speak much more, just to mention, let's say, and we can discuss it further on, 2 or 3 ideas, let's say complex notions that may be a tool, but may be helpful tools, let's say, in order to achieve that. The one is environmental justice, and the other one is, let's say, both material and digital equal liberty, in terms of the combination of equality and liberty. If we are, I don't want to tire you in order to get to focus very much in the content of these notions, but if we are to actually provide societies with and co-build together with the people certain values that are complex enough in order to describe and to actually transform in a more democratic way our contemporary societies, then we'll have the necessary tools in order to, also in the European Union elections, but in everyday life in European Union, in Europe, and in our societies, in the more local societies and collectives, to actually, let's say, facilitate, but also manage to defend the democratic walls that we need to defend. And as we have seen, especially the last 5 to 6 years, and even more, I'd say the last decade, in general, have been crushed, almost crushed.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nikos. So let's go finally to Georgios for your opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you, Sophie, Petros, and Nikos, for your contributions. I agree with most of your points because we are facing a very concerning state of democracy across Europe that technically demands our attention, and as recent authoritarian practices have been adopted by leaders throughout the region, threaten its very foundation. And this trend, of course, has not only blurred the political landscape, but also challenged the core principles of democracy itself, like Sophie pointed out, because the threat is significant. What is particularly striking is the involvement of governments in spearheading this wave of unconstitutional practices, which is a departure, from the more expected quarters of far-right and openly authoritarian governments. So the infiltration of those tendencies into mainstream politics has become increasingly evident across Europe, as we've seen in Greece. And I guess that the question is, how can this be stopped? What can we do in order to somehow cleanse politics from such practices? Within the EU, the emergence of such authoritarian voices have been quite alarming. We have seen this with Viktor Orban from Hungary, with Giorgia Meloni from Italy. There is technically governments showcasing a troubling mix of selective European policy adjustments coupled with heavy-handed domestic agendas. And if we go to Italy, we can see that latest legislation against LGBTQ couples has been very aggressive. And this, of course, shows us that some governments are focusing on authoritarian adjustments within their own agenda. But if we look at other nations like Greece, we can see that somehow those authoritarian tendencies are accompanied by a focus on pro-Europeanism. And the Greek government has consistently abused this authority, flouting the rule of law and democratic norms. So the recent wiretapping scandal, as Sophie and Petros have pointed out, serves as a stark reminder of this erosion of democratic values. So despite all the evidence, despite all the allegations and all the reports, of course, the government has engaged in a campaign of gaslighting, attempting to downplay the significance of the scandal and also discredit its critics. Such behavior not only undermines trust in democratic institutions, but also highlights the government's failure to uphold transparency and accountability. So it's worth noting the irony that erosion of democracy remains a taboo topic for many Greeks, despite the relatively recent establishment of democratic governance. So the legacy of the military dictatorship that persisted until the mid-1970s looms large, underscoring the fragility of democratic institutions, something that many political actors seem to consistently ignore. So can we somehow protect democracy? Can we deal with this relentless onslaught of authoritarian practices without external support? I don't think so. And in this context, the intervention and proactive actions by the European Union are not just desirable, but imperative, because the EU must protect its foundational principles and member states from further democratic decay. Greece is an example that, at the moment, the government cannot police itself. The government is abusing its powers and the rule of law to impose its own practices, something that within the EU seems to be acceptable. Only collective effort and unwavering commitment to democratic values can help Europe and make, I would say, institutions more powerful through those turbulent times in order to emerge stronger on the other side. Because the example of Greece is indeed an extremely worrying case after the wiretapping scandal emerged in 2022 and up until today remains completely uninvestigated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I wonder if I could just interject on this on the basis of what we've heard so far. So just listening to Nikos's comments, you were referring to the term crisis quite frequently. And I was thinking, listening to you speaking about that is there some connection between the sense in which people perceive there to be political crises or public health crises or whatever it might be, and this kind of activity? So, I mean, if we look at the COVID pandemic, for example, there's quite a lot of evidence that surveillance activities were taking place there, that certain voices were being closed down. And you could say if any crisis situation is akin to almost like a war type situation, these are precisely the situations where you tend to get surveillance activities happening. So I guess part of my question there is, shouldn't we not sort of play up this idea of crisis too much in many situations? Because the more people believe there is a crisis, it seems to me the more governments are likely to believe they're justified in surveilling other people's conduct. So I think you can overdo the idea that everything is a political crisis. Maybe you get this type of behavior if you do that. Then secondly, I thought, listening to Georgios, what you were saying, I was thinking, well, it's okay to say that the European Union should do something about this, but who guards the guardians? I mean, this is a classic question of why wouldn't we think that the European Union itself could engage in surveillance activities if its member states have been doing so? There doesn't seem to be any reason to believe that it wouldn't. So yeah, those are the two sort of immediate reactions I had to what I heard.
Shall I begin? Yeah, perfect. Mark, thanks for your question in the comment. You're definitely right about it. So we need to actually not overuse certain terms, and especially the idea of what we call the crasiology. And we tend to have it, especially, let's say, in political philosophy, but also in politics and in society in general, and during the last years. But what it is important, though, is to understand that, let's say, after the zeros, and especially during the recent or the previous decade, we are faced with a different form of crisis, and perhaps I'm right, perhaps I'm wrong, probably on that. But it's not that deep crisis, but are crises that remain. So there are crises that are multiple in a globalized level, and they are interconnected, and we need to understand. I suggest that we must understand in a certain way that in order to face them and in order to actually be able to overcome them, we need to understand them, realize them, and understand that the solutions have to be holistic and have to be, if not globalized, and at least in a certain aspect of the EU. That's why I try to concentrate on ideas or notions or solutions or towards solutions that are a bit more complex and how are democratic in their core, but they are facing certain crises that have to do with the everyday life of the citizens. Let's say environmental justice, that it's like facing the climate crisis, but also concentrated very much and mainly on the social justice aspect. So people, at least in Greece, they do not listen, or they are not that interested, let's say, in terms of privacy or in terms of surveillance, it's that much that in order to understand the serious democratic deficit that lies there. But if you discuss about how this actually is the first step in order to break down social justice and actually fight over social justice, then you will have certain parts of society, certain groups of society that may be also opinion leaders in the level with you in that fight. So yes, we do not we should not actually overuse the term crisis, because then everything is crisis, and crisis becomes something ontological that it's okay then in order to, we can use whatever means we want in order to overcome crisis. But I'm not sure if we have realized yet in a collective way, in a collective level, how many crises are going on and how much and in which degree are interconnected. So we haven't renewed our vocabulary in terms of values and ideas in order to be able to face them. And I don't want to tire you more.
To answer your question, Mark, which is really interesting in regards to the EU and its values, I would direct people to Stephen Levitsky and how he underscores the critical issue of quality of democracy. And he emphasized that we all need to consciously embrace those principles which are essential for the flourishing and advancement of democracy. So presently within the EU, we kind of observe what I describe a troubling distortion of these values, particularly evident in the phenomenon of democratic backsliding. And that can be seen in Greece. It's not really a taboo to point that out anymore. And this regression, as correctly identified, is linked to challenges concerning the rule of law. And the European Parliament's resolution in February 2024, just a month ago actually, further amplifies the urgency of addressing those issues. So I don't want to take more of your time, but Europe faces challenges of holding accountable member states. That's what it is. And states that flout the rule of law, and while the EU cannot directly dictate national legislation, it must devise mechanisms to penalize countries found to be infringing upon the rule of law and democratic principles. So one potential avenue of addressing this issue is to use existing frameworks, such as the rule of law, which assesses and monitors adherence to the rule of law among member states, or leveraging diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, or withholding certain privileges that could serve as effective measures to ensure compliance. Ultimately, ensuring the integrity of democracy within the EU is essential and necessitates proactive measures to address instances of violations in order to uphold democratic values across all member states.
Okay, I wonder if we could bring perhaps our MEPs back in at this point to comment on what you've heard so far. So, Sophie, I know you've not got that much time, so perhaps, Sophie, you'd like to come back in?
Yes, thanks. I'd like to respond to a couple of things that were said. To start with the last remarks by Georgios. The point is there, it's not so difficult to find solutions. I mean, we have, I think, every solution that we could possibly think of is in the recommendations of the European Parliament. It's perfectly possible within the current treaties. The only thing that's missing is political will. They don't want it. And why would they voluntarily give up, their access to this wonderful toy? Why would they do that? They're not. I mean, even the fact that not just NSO, but also Intellexa has been blacklisted and sanctioned has not led to any move in the European Union. Intellexa still has, is still established in Ireland with a tax break. It's still doing business with the Greek authorities, with probably many more authorities. It is still through Nexa. It is still trading. It is exporting freely. There's no problem. The only thing is that Malta has now threatened Taldillian to revoke his golden passport. Well, hey, he can't sleep anymore. He's got so many, So it's not a matter of solutions. It's a matter of political will. And if I look at, for example, the fact that Ursula von der Leyen, she went holidaying with Mitsotakis. She's giving bribes of $10 billion euros to Viktor Orban. I mean, she has absolutely no interest in democracy at all. The only thing she is interested in is being pals with the heads of government and the head of state. Not least because she will need them for her re-election. But that's clearly, it's also the habitat where she feels best. She has absolutely nothing with parliamentary democracy, scrutiny, accountability, not just when it comes to spyware. Is it a crisis? Should we call it a crisis? Yes, I would say it's a crisis. But if you think that there is an inflation of the term crisis, fine, we can use another term. But I do agree with you that it's very difficult to get across to people that this is a crisis or threat or whatever you want to call it. And the point is that in bitter irony, the whole idea behind the European Union was to have a free democratic society and a democratic rule of law. Because is it by coincidence that the four countries which are most implicated in the whole spyware scandal, namely Greece, Poland, Hungary, and Spain, had dictatorships until fairly recently? I still have a vivid memory of that. So who says that we are immune from authoritarianism? Who says that? And the point is that in many cases, it's not just authoritarianism. It's just plain banal kleptocracy. And I think the one thing that people do understand is that, very often they distrust their governments. They see corruption scandals. They see bad governance. And the thing is that you need these democratic checks and balances like journalists to bring these scandals to light. So in that sense, they are the allies of the normal people, let's say, the regular people, small people, if you want, against the elite. So I think this is something that we need to make very clear. Democracy is not some abstract notion. Democracy makes sure that, you don't get unnecessary train crashes, that when there are floods, that the authorities will make sure that that you're protected, that you're compensated for, and that the dead bodies of cattle are removed. I mean, two random examples. So good governance, democracy, checks and balances, scrutiny is in the interest of the people. This is something that we have to get across. And I think it is, in a way, is very sad that in Greece in particular, expectations of government are so low. People don't expect anything of government. They think this is normal. I mean, that's the worst. And I think we need to change that. Not just give them proper government, but also give them the expectation of good government. Last question on if the EU is to act, who will guard the guardians? Well, that's actually not a very difficult question to answer, because this is why I started my intervention by saying the essence of democracy is checks and balance. it's not elections. Elections are part of it, but it's not defining. And democracy as powers and countervailing powers has been building up over centuries, whereas elections is a fairly recent phenomenon. But keeping power in check, in other words, making sure that power doesn't become absolute power, that is the core of democracy. And those checks and balances should exist at European level as much as anywhere else. And that is why, maybe a bit on a side note, but I think the European Parliament, for example, should be part of those checks and balances. We have a very skewed system at EU level, but because many people think the EU is just some technocratic, UFO or something, they don't think that European democracy can be broken, but it can. And the European Parliament has, in the last 5 years, largely failed its duty of being a parliamentary watchdog. It has not helped the Commission to account. I mean, I find there have been at least 10 moments where I think a motion of censure against the Commission would have been justified. And the non-action in the case of the abuse of spyware, and let's not forget the illicit trade in spyware. I mean, just breaking the export rules right under the noses of the Commission. I mean, that really merits a stiff debate, possibly the request for some commissioners to step down, and I also think a motion of censure.
Hey, great. Petros, would you like to come back?
Yes, I would very much like to come back to a Europe that is democratic, a European Union that upholds the rule of law. I would very much like to come back to a place where a government that so blatantly breaks the rule of law would have seen its electoral percentages go down rather than up. But I have a feeling that this is like wanting to go back to a normal weather, wanting to go back to a minus 1.5 degree, and it seems there's no going back. Now we have elections ahead of us in the European Union for the Parliament, which Sophie very well said, failed to take the proper actions, and it looks like the election is going to bring back a majority that is going to be even more lax into exercising its overseeing duties. This is going to take us, and if that is, God forbid, coupled with a new Trump election, then we're looking at a very, very different, environment, political environment than the one we were expecting to be seeing. Now, in a very brief sojourn into what happens with the climate, here in Greece also we had a climate catastrophe which somehow pushed people into more autocratic directions than more democratic directions. We were very fast into aiming at the different and the weaker people in the society and blaming them for the problems of fires. We had a collapse of authority in the floods. We decided that, the government decided that the scientific community is partisan, that we can do away with proper transparency in public works, in the need of speed. So we're moving towards a very different environment. And the first step that we need to take towards that is to campaign hard for the next 3 months and try to get a better majority back in Parliament.
So, I mean, just reacting to all the comments there, it sounds very much as though really we're in areas where you're talking about fundamental issues of constitutional design is what it strikes me listening to this. So, I mean, I'm not familiar enough, I have to admit, with the European Union's basic overall structures in terms of what constitutional provisions are currently there that would allow the EU to be intervening in these situations to protect democratic rights. Do members of the panel have ideas about particular kinds of constitutional designs that they would want to see in place to maximize the checks and balances or the protections? That's, one thought that came to mind. But I am struck, and I don't want to be too provocative by saying this, but I am struck that I think all the contributors are tending in the direction of suggesting that the problem is with the voters, that they're voting for the wrong people. And, that could well be the case in the next few weeks. If people vote for people who are lax about these kind of things, what can you do about it other than blame the voters? Anybody on that?
Well, I guess that never works. I mean, it's like, blaming the customer for having a product that doesn't sell. So yes, I think I should be fully taking the blame here. But then again, it's probably a zeitgeist, and it's probably an ability to maybe it's a little bit too late after having had 40 years of very hard neoliberal and let's say disinvestment from public goods. So yeah, you have a good point here.
Sophie, do you want to come back in?
Well, of course, it's all about blaming the voters. But we do have, as all citizens, because even politicians are citizens. Some think that we come from Mars, but we are actually people, human beings, we're citizens. And we do have a collective responsibility. We do. And I do think we you can have a lot of safeguards built into the system, but ultimately you cannot legislate against bad intention. But I think it is very important that we all become aware of the weaknesses of the constitutional framework of the European Union. I was going to post a link to a little booklet that I wrote, which you can read online in PDF. On this matter. It's called Naked Power. And it's the point is that when you try to address these institutional shortcomings, you call for change, and not just treaty change, but also the change in how the institutions work. And people go like, they roll their eyes, oh, it's boring, which is very strange, because this is about how we organize our democracy, how we make it robust and resilient. And if you have in any national country, there are permanent debates about constitutional issues the whole time, everywhere. So, and then people find it it's political and it's about us. But there is, national politicians have a heavy responsibility here, and we have to look very closely at the language that we're using. At how we, how should I put it? Making sure that we connect with citizens directly, because national politics and national institutions have absolutely no interest in a strong European Union. What we have seen in the last 20 years is that when the European Union developed for decades in the direction of a more, let's say, of a parliamentary democracy, for 20 years now, it's been backtracking, and we are more intergovernmental now than ever before. We have a European Council of government leaders, which is basically, who are in the mid. It's one big power grab. They're completely overstepping their powers, and nobody says anything. Why? Because most people don't even know what the treaties say. So here we have to start with talking to people, explaining. They have to be educated at home, and as citizens, we also have to demand democracy, accountability, transparency, the rule of law. And I mean, the situation does look grim, but there are some rays of light, like Poland, like the fact that in Germany people are taking to the streets to protest. Like, here and there are some people who are, let's say, who are opposing this autocratic trend. They are elected. I mean, there are some signs of hope. And I know, I'm a historian. I always say, we'll be okay. Things will be okay. It may take a few centuries, but we'll be okay. All we can hope for in this case is that, we're not going to go through the same mistakes that we've made, in particular in the 20th century, before we come to our senses. We've tried dictatorship. It was no fun. We've tried world wars. Was not a success. So please, let's not go down that road again and strengthen the European structures. And now I'm afraid that after this, I'm going to try and paste the link in the chat, and then I'm afraid I will have to leave. So
that's okay. Thank you very much for your
sorry about this. I'll leave the last show.
Thank you very much, Sophie.
Okay.
Georgios, you've been waiting to come in.
Yes, Mark. I wanted to agree with Sophie fully on this, and I wanted to briefly conclude that one of the most pressing issues here is definitely the normalization of political immunity, which has become entrenched in the political landscape. So it is a problem that was notably highlighted by the IMF when IMF intervened in 2010 with the bailout program, and they addressed the issues of systemic corruption within the country. Despite this, all the discussions surrounding systemic corruption have remained absent from Greek politics. Technically, we need more accountability. We need to open up discussions about transparency, and particularly about how political parties are able to be above the law in many ways. And this applies to all political parties. Technically, the wiretapping scandal has acted as an example of how political immunity can be abused in order to save people from getting convicted, from getting investigated, from being prosecuted. It's a matter of law. It's not just about political ideology or political identity or anything else. It's about using democratic institutions to hold those responsible accountable for their own actions. On to Nikos.
Agreeing with yours and everybody, trying also to address one of the questions that we have received from the attendants. It's not only about let's say societies in general or the voters are mistaken about things. It's also what was mentioned before, the power of gaslighting through the mass media in contemporary societies, and especially in the European Union. We see this also in Greece, of course. So, returning back to critical theory, the three basic steps: enlightening, empowering, emancipating. If we were also to be sure that the line of information is clear from top down towards the objectivity, or at least in the subjectivity of the information that the voters are receiving, and being scientific, etc., that would be a very huge step of then accusing actually the voters for being for making the bad decision, etc. So now you have also the aspect of misleading the voters in many different aspects. So what can be done? Enlightenment is the first step, and not only, of course, education is the first and the last step in everything, but also something that usually we do not shed enough light on is the aspect of cultivation. So in Greece, at least, we have many well-educated persons and voters, etc., but we do not have many well-cultivated. Let's say, and I'm not saying that in an elitist kind of way, but I mean that in order to understand and being enough cultivated in a certain value system that you feel the pressure and the passion also to defend what is deeply democratic for the right reason, and not only for instrumental reasons for you and your family, or let's say your very close community. So understand what society is and why it is also in your favor, but in favor of the next generation, etc., to actually defend the core aspects of the society. And of course, this is the democratic aspects of the society. So education, cultivation towards the right values with the right goals for the right reasons. And then, if the core of this discussion is to actually attempt or achieve a deeper democratization, then I feel that also protecting the environment and being able to having a more democratic digital space out of AI, etc., 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 will follow. And I do not see this kind of debate, or at least discourse, in the European level at this moment, before, let's say, 1-2 months before the European elections. And this is what worries me most, at least personally.
Okay, well, I I apologize. I had missed actually the questions coming into the chat box, but they are actually quite closely related to some of the same themes that we've been looking at. So the question from Michael, what can citizens do about all of this? From what I'm seeing, the Greeks don't seem to care about the level of violations taking place. I guess this comes down to the question of, how much do voters care about this? Are we blaming the voters for not caring enough about it? I do think that's quite an important question. There's a question to Georgios specifically. You mentioned something about conscious adoption of democratic values. What does this mean? And I guess maybe this is a point where we ought to just articulate briefly what do we mean by democratic values? What do we mean by democratic accountability when we're dealing in this space? It sounds like a very basic question, but people are asking about it. So, Georgios, do you want to come back on that?
Yes, the two questions are interconnected in a way. And I would say that an adoption of democratic values means that citizens use their ideology and, of course, their understanding of a healthy democracy to perhaps protect democracy by voting in elections, by exercising their democratic rights, by feeling part of a vibrant democracy. I wouldn't say that there is a lack of adoption of democratic values in Greece, but I think that the lack of interest in political processes and understanding of political culture is a problem which the political system is absolutely responsible for. From all parties, all ideologies, we are seeing a complete disconnection of people with politics. And subsequently, this leads to a lack of adoption of democratic values. People don't feel to being part of that democracy. How can we fix that? To go back to Michael, at this stage, I think that the political culture must begin to embrace this discussion, to embrace this dialogue, to embrace this debate, and find ways, some of them more elaborative than others, to address what has gone wrong over the last 40 or 50 years. Because, like I said, Greek democracy is very fresh, it's very recent, and it was established in the 70s. So, looking back at those years, not really much, of course, can be compared between those eras, but we have a lot of thinking to do in the long run to protect and uphold democratic institutions and their quality in Greece.
Petros, would you like to come back in?
Yes, I think that beyond democratic values, we have to face an issue of democratic polity delivering goods and services and freedoms to large numbers of the populace. I think that we have been running a democracy for the past 30 or 40 years, which has allowed more and more people to have a lower their living level of living, and this is what you're getting. What we are getting. We have created a democracy which has failed to address the climate crisis, failed to address the inequality crisis, failed to address the public health crisis. And that is why, like I said before, I was a few days ago in a discussion with the fire department of Greece and the Minister of State, actually, Mr. Kertsos, and more or less they said, look, we have a big climate crisis, and that's all that we can do. So once we have arrived at a democratic system which is patently unable to guarantee the life and property of citizens, then people are going to look otherwise. So I think it's a little bit more than education and cultivation and all that. It's about making sure that we have transparent, evidence-based, science-based democratic political systems that will deliver. And as we move rapidly, and I'm sorry to use the inflated term of crisis, but as we move in towards, if you look at the temperatures and what is we know is coming ahead, we know from last week's European Environmental Agency's report that we're looking at the best case scenario, a Europe of plus 3 degrees, even if the world sticks to 1.5, which it isn't. So the question is, how do you move into an emergency situation while preserving the democratic way of governance? which of course takes more time, takes more discussion, and so on and so forth. So this is the biggest the crisis of our time. How do we make sure that we move into this world of uncertainty and crisis while we have democracy? There are many places around the world which have less and less of democracy, and people are seeing them as more effective answers to their problems. So we have to face what went wrong in the 90s and the 200s and maybe the 10s, and take it from there.
Well, I think that's an interesting question. So, I mean, if you take, some people have looked to China as some kind of exemplar. They were doing during the pandemic. Do we really want to look to the Chinese as exemplars of what to do, especially given that they are also contributing to the climate crisis?
Well, if you ask me, no. I mean, that's the exact point, that this doesn't really work. But then again, simple answers sometimes work for people who are in distress, and people need answers. They need them now, and definitely do well in the pandemic. But they're actually doing quite well in the climate crisis. They're installing renewables in a speed much faster than everybody else combined. They have taken the opportunity to corner the market in automobiles, in solar, and so on and so forth. So they are increasingly appearing as an alternative model. And even if you have the United States looking at a less democratic model, then I think you have your answers there.
Okay, why don't we just wrap up with maybe just some final comments from Georgios and Nikos, if you want to. So I think we've just gone over an hour now, so we should probably be thinking about closing up. So if you'd like to make some closing remarks, it'd be a good time to do it.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, I wanted to just highlight that what we have seen in the last, I would say, past decade has been definitely an issue. Looking ahead, of course, and also taking all the recent events into account and the revelations that have emerged, that the government was employing spyware and what this means for the quality of democracy in Europe as a whole, I wanted to say that, I'm going back to the normalization of political immunity. We need better accountability. And for the European election, somehow this must be addressed. Unfortunately, we're seeing a response which will probably lead to 25% of the seats in the European Parliament taken by far-right forces. That also indicates and underscores, of course, the importance of cooperation within the Parliament, because now the far-right will have a say in shaping the agenda and making decisions, something that we haven't seen until now. And undoubtedly, this might have an extremely serious impact on the quality of decision-making within the European Parliament. But we have to somehow remain hopeful and work towards a collaboration that will result in the most, I would say, fruitful and less destructive decision-making. Ultimately, I can tell that if there is a coalition between the European People's Party and ECR, then I'm not really sure what this could mean in the long run for the European Union as a whole. But my hope is that some of those discussions can be normalized in politics in order to shed more light on how those processes can become transparent, and we can find ways to hold governments and domestic politics take them basically into account and hold them responsible for their own actions. Even if it sounds like an extremely hopeful and difficult process, it must be somehow achieved centrally from the European Union. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Nikos, would you like to close out for us?
Yeah, it would be an honor. Just to underline a bit the necessity of what I was trying to say is that, of course, we need to strengthen the accountability and put more also pressure, but empower our democratic institutions in order for them to be accountable back to society. and also for society to be able to actually secure a certain position that can control the institutions in a certain sense through democratic elected persons, etc. The key question here is, though, that how you make the voters, the masses, ready and empowered enough to engage in such aims and goals on political level. And I feel that the answer to that is the vision. The vision, not in like a metaphysical sense, etc., but a concrete body of ideas and values that are renewed in terms of actually addressing the main problems of the crisis that we just named and recalled now through our topic. So in order to create this vision needs to be something that deeply democratic, and also return back to the national, the local, but also the European identity in whole, and construct it very carefully in order to be able to reach out top down, to be grounded to each European citizen. In a very dystopian, and I cannot stretch how dystopian is this way, the far right manages to achieve this formulation of a new vision that can falsely address the problems of the citizens, but at least, as we unfortunately will see in the next EU elections, manages to achieve that. Why that? Because it seems to have a vision, and it seems to actually speaks to certain cultural identities of the citizens. So I feel that we're discussing about the right key points and the right crises and the right problems that need to be had. But if we do not actually put all this together and communicate it through a very concrete and coherent vision, then we cannot see a democratic turn in the European Union in general as we wish. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for a really, I think, stimulating discussion. We've had a number of different perspectives there. And thank you to everybody for actually tuning in to the Zoom session today. So thank you all very much. And especially to, Sophie's had to leave us, but especially to Petros for taking the time out from his very busy schedule. So thank you very much indeed. And
thank you very much.
Join us again.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.